You got a call sign, old man? Or did they just call you lost? The laughter came quick and easy, the kind born from youth, polished boots, and too much confidence worn too early. It cut across the hot afternoon air outside the Academy's communications annex, where heat shimmered above the asphalt and the distant cadence of drill commands rolled over the parade ground like surf. 3 cadets stood blocking the narrow path, their fresh uniforms crisp enough to slice paper, faces still carrying the hard edges of boys trying to look like officers. At their center was Cadet Ethan Cole, 21, square jaw, iron certainty in every movement. He leaned against a metal railing and looked down at the old man with amused contempt. Samuel Mercer paused with one weathered hand resting on a mop handle, the kind issued decades ago and repaired too many times to count. At 78, his shoulders had bowed slightly with age, but there was nothing fragile in the stillness around him. He wore a faded green maintenance jacket despite the 88-degree heat, sleeves rolled just enough to show sun-worn forearms and a pale scar running toward his wrist. He did not answer at first. His eyes, pale and quiet as winter sky, drifted past the cadets toward the radio tower rising over the base, as if listening to something none of them could hear. Ethan smirked and pushed harder. Come on, old-timer. Everybody in this place has a call sign. What was yours, Bingo 6? Grandpa Actual. The other cadets laughed louder. One mimed a salute. Another tapped the old analog field radio sitting beside the door and joked maybe the museum wanted its relic back. The mockery hung sharp in the air, but Mercer absorbed it the way old stone absorbs rain. No reaction, no defense, only silence heavy enough to unsettle. That silence bothered Ethan more than protest would have. He stepped closer until polished shoes ground against the gravel. I asked you a question. For the first time Mercer looked directly at him. The Academy noise seemed to fall away. Even the flags beyond the quad looked momentarily still. When he spoke, the voice was low, rough with age, but steady enough to carry. Raven. 6. Just 2 words. Nothing more. Yet something in the way he said them seemed to alter the air. One cadet's grin faltered. Another shifted backward before realizing he had moved. Ethan gave a short laugh too quick to sound natural. Raven 6, he echoed. That's supposed to scare somebody? But the old field radio beside the door crackled with a burst of static, sudden and harsh, making all 3 cadets jump. A hiss, then silence. Mercer's gaze never left Ethan's face. It was not a challenge. Worse, it was recognition, as if he had seen this arrogance before in jungles, deserts, and decades now buried. Across the courtyard, an instructor in combat communications, Major Nolan Pierce, had been walking toward the annex carrying a clipboard. At the words Raven 6, he stopped cold. 50 yards away, he had heard them clearly. The blood seemed to drain from his face. He looked from Mercer to the cadets and back again, as if the old man standing with a janitor's mop had become impossible to reconcile with memory. Ethan noticed none of it. He forced another grin and jabbed a finger toward Mercer's chest. You expect us to believe some ghost story call sign? Mercer's expression did not change. A dry wind pushed across the tarmac, rattling the antenna cables overhead. Somewhere above them a hawk circled in widening rings. And for one strange second, under the white glare of the afternoon sun, the Academy no longer felt like a training ground. It felt like a place where something forgotten had just answered when called. Major Nolan Pierce did not move for several seconds. The clipboard in his hand hung forgotten at his side while the hot wind stirred dust along the edge of the communications yard. The cadets noticed his stare before they understood it. Ethan Cole gave a nervous half-smile and lifted his chin, trying to reclaim control of a moment already slipping from him. Major, you heard this, right? He called, forcing humor into his voice. Our maintenance man here says he is Raven 6. The joke should have landed. It did not. Pierce crossed the pavement with measured steps, boots grinding softly against loose gravel, his expression unreadable. Up close, his eyes went first to Mercer, not the cadets. There was caution in that look, but something deeper too, something close to disbelief. Sir, he said quietly. the word almost lost in the hum of antenna wires overhead. Ethan stiffened. He had never heard the major use that tone with anyone outside the commandant's office. Mercer gave only the faintest nod. The old field radio beside the annex door hissed again, a thread of static crawling through the speaker before dying into silence. Pierce glanced at it as if the sound itself carried memory. "Cadet Cole," he said without looking away from Mercer. "Return to formation." Ethan blinked. "Sir." Pierce turned then, and whatever the cadets saw in his face made them obey instinctively. No raised voice, no threat, just authority stripped bare. Yet Ethan hesitated, pride wrestling with unease. "With respect, Major, this is some kind of misunderstanding. He is a janitor." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Move." The word landed hard enough to end debate. The two other cadets stepped back at once, but Ethan lingered half a beat too long, his confidence now brittle. Mercer had not spoken again. He stood in the same still posture, one hand on the worn mop handle, as if the entire exchange belonged to another lifetime repeating itself. Pierce lowered his voice. "Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you something." The old man looked toward the distant parade ground where a bugle call drifted thin in the afternoon heat. "You already know enough," he said. Those words seemed to strike Pierce harder than accusation could have. A memory stirred behind his eyes, old military archives, rumors whispered over classified training briefs, a vanished reconnaissance element whose call signs were taught almost like cautionary scripture. Raven 6 had not been spoken casually in 50 years. It had belonged to a man officially listed nowhere and remembered everywhere that mattered. Pierce's pulse hammered. He reached slowly for the handset mounted beside the annex wall, fingers hovering before lifting it. Ethan watched from 10 feet away, confusion spreading into something colder. "What are you doing?" he asked. Pierce ignored him and keyed a secure internal line. Rarely touched outside exercises. His voice when he spoke was controlled but tight. "Operations, this is Major Pierce at Comms Annex 2. I need command authentication on an old designation." A pause. Static whispered. "Proceed." Pierce swallowed once. "Verify call sign Raven 6. Silence answered long enough to feel wrong. Even the cadets sensed it. Then a new voice came over the line. Older, clipped, suddenly alert. "Repeat that call sign." Pierce looked at Mercer. The old man had not moved. Heat shimmer danced above the runway beyond them, bending the world into wavering silver. "Raven 6, Pierce repeated. The response did not come immediately. Somewhere on the line, someone had stopped breathing. Then only 5 words returned, low and urgent. "Do not let him leave." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. For the first time all afternoon, none of them were laughing. The words on the secure line seemed to hang in the hot air long after the speaker went silent. "Do not let him leave." Major Nolan Pierce slowly lowered the handset, but his hand remained on the receiver as if letting go might break something fragile and old. Ethan Cole stared, the arrogance in his face replaced by a confusion that looked almost boyish. "Major, who is he?" he asked, but even he heard how small his voice sounded now. Pierce did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on Samuel Mercer, studying him with the wary focus of a man standing too close to buried history. Mercer shifted at last, not in discomfort, but as though some old weight had stirred. His fingers brushed the faded seam of his maintenance jacket, and for an instant his thumb rested on a worn patch hidden near the inside cuff. That touch seemed to carry him elsewhere. The academy yard, bright with white sun and humming transformers, dissolved behind the far look in his pale eyes. Rain replaced heat. Not ordinary rain, but warm jungle rain drumming on broad leaves and pooling black in boot prints. Radio static hissed in darkness beneath a canvas tarp lit only by a dim red lamp. A young lieutenant with mud on his face leaned over a field map while a voice crackled through a handset. "Raven 6, your extraction window is closing." Mercer was no old groundskeeper there. He was lean, watchful, every sense tuned to distance and silence. A helicopter rotor beat somewhere beyond the trees, heavy as a heartbeat. Beside him a younger soldier looked barely old enough to shave, hands shaking over a coded notebook. Mercer had placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder and spoken with calm that made fear lose ground. The memory flashed and vanished as quickly as heat lightning. Back in the academy yard, Mercer's hand slipped from the hidden patch. Ethan had seen the movement. Curiosity overrode caution. "What is that?" he asked, stepping closer before Pierce could stop him. He reached toward Mercer's cuff, meaning perhaps only to expose the old insignia and prove this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. But the moment his fingers brushed the edge of the fabric, Pierce seized his wrist. "Do not!" The force in the major's voice froze everyone. Ethan jerked back as though burned. A silence settled deeper than before. Across the quad, a formation cadence faded. Somewhere a flag line clinked in the wind. Mercer looked at Ethan not with anger, but with a tired sadness that unsettled the cadet more than rebuke could have. "There are names," Mercer said quietly. "Meant to stay in the dark." Ethan swallowed but said nothing. Pierce stepped away and pulled a secure cell phone from his belt, moving several yards off before dialing another number. His voice dropped low, urgent, almost reverent. "Colonel, this is Pierce. We have a situation involving a legacy designation. I believe Raven 6 is standing in my comms yard." A long pause followed. Then Pierce's posture changed, spine straightening unconsciously at whatever voice answered. He listened, face draining further. "Understood," he said. "Yes, sir. We will hold position." He ended the call and returned, but now his eyes flicked once toward the access road leading into the academy, as though expecting something impossible to arrive. Ethan followed that glance. "What did command say?" Pierce answered without taking his eyes off Mercer. "They did not ask if I was mistaken." He paused. "They asked if he was alone." A chill moved through Ethan. Despite the heat, from far beyond the parade field came the low growl of approaching engines, distant but unmistakable, more than one vehicle, moving fast toward the academy gates. The sound of engines grew from a distant murmur into a low rolling presence that seemed to press against the academy grounds. Ethan Cole turned toward the access road, squinting through the shimmer rising off the pavement. Two black command sedans appeared first beyond the gate, followed by a dark Suburban with government plates, all moving too fast for a place built on ceremony and routine. Their tires whispered over the road and came to a precise stop near the communications annex. No sirens, no drama, only the kind of arrival that carried its own authority. The three cadets stood frozen. Even Major Nolan Pierce seemed to brace without meaning to. Doors opened in practice sequence. Two uniformed aides stepped out first, scanning the area. Then a broad-shouldered lieutenant general in summer service khakis emerged from the rear vehicle, silver hair close-cropped, posture straight enough to shame men half his age. His nameplate caught the sun. General Warren Holloway. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Holloway was not a ceremonial visitor. He was spoken of at the academy the way storms are spoken of offshore, distant until suddenly overhead. Yet the general did not glance at the cadets, did not acknowledge Pierce's salute. His eyes locked immediately on Samuel Mercer. For one long second, no one moved. The wind stirred the flag above the annex. Somewhere, a loose halyard tapped metal in steady rhythm. Holloway took 3 deliberate steps forward and stopped before the old man in the faded maintenance jacket. Ethan waited for interrogation, accusation, some impossible correction. Instead, the general drew himself to full attention. The motion was crisp, instinctive, almost youthful in its precision. Then he raised his hand in a formal salute. The world seemed to go silent around it. Ethan actually stepped backward before realizing he had done so. Beside him, the other cadets did the same. No order had been given. Their bodies simply obeyed something older than understanding. Major Pierce's breath caught audibly. General Holloway held the salute and spoke in a voice low enough to feel intimate, strong enough to carry. "Permission to address Raven 6, sir." The title struck Ethan harder than any reprimand. "Sir." To the janitor he had mocked less than an hour ago. Mercer looked at the general for a long moment, and for the first time a faint expression touched his weathered face. Not pride, not triumph, but the weary recognition of one soldier meeting another after too many silent years. He returned the smallest nod. "You kept your shoulders straight, Warren," he said. The general's jaw tightened as though emotion had brushed too near. "Only because you taught me to." Ethan's mind reeled. Taught him. This was not legend overheard in archives. This was personal. A living thread no one in the yard had known existed. Holloway lowered his salute but not his posture. Behind him, one of the aides quietly handed Pierce a slim leather folio. Pierce opened it and stared at the top page. Red classification marks. Mission photographs older than he was. A grainy image of 5 men beside a jungle extraction point. One face unmistakably Mercer. Another a much younger Warren Holloway. Ethan caught only a glimpse before the folio closed. His mouth had gone dry. He thought of the joke about Bingo 6 and felt heat rise to his face. Mercer seemed not to notice. He looked beyond them toward the radio tower where the afternoon light flashed on steel. "You should not have come in person," he said. Holloway gave a faint, almost incredulous smile. "Sir," command disagreed. He glanced then at the shaken cadets, finally acknowledging them. "These gentlemen asked your call sign?" Mercer said nothing. The silence answered enough. Holloway looked back to Ethan, and there was no anger in his gaze, which made it worse. "Cadet," he said quietly. "Do you know what stepping back means in a formation?" Ethan swallowed. "Making room for rank, sir." The general's eyes returned to Mercer. "Sometimes," he said, "it means making room for history." The words settled over the communications yard with the weight of something ceremonial, something older than regulations or rank charts. Even, the wind seemed quieter. Ethan Cole stood motionless, his earlier bravado drained away, while General Warren Holloway turned slightly and gestured toward the shaded bench outside the annex. "Walk with me, sir," he said to Mercer, but there was request in the phrase, not command. Mercer gave the faintest shrug and moved with unhurried steps, the worn mop left leaning against the wall like a discarded disguise. Holloway walked beside him, not ahead. The sight alone would have become legend if the cadets had dared speak of it. Major Nolan Pierce followed at respectful distance, carrying the leather folio as though it held something sacred. Ethan and the other cadets remained rooted until Holloway paused halfway to the bench and said without turning, "Cadets, you should hear what arrogance nearly made you miss." Shame and curiosity pulled them forward. They formed an awkward line several feet away, no longer challengers but witnesses. Mercer lowered himself onto the bench, studying the radio tower as if old ghosts lived in its steel frame. Holloway remained standing. "Do you remember the valley north of Contum?" the general asked softly. Mercer let out a dry breath that might have been amusement. "I remember the rain." The words seemed to open a door. Holloway looked not at the cadets now but into distance, speaking as though reporting to memory itself. He told of a reconnaissance team cut off beyond mapped territory, a mission never printed in public histories, a young lieutenant certain he was too clever to be afraid until his radio failed and the jungle swallowed every direction. He did not describe combat. He described silence, wet leaves, dead batteries, the sound of a single calm voice over a broken field set saying, "Hold position. I am coming." That voice, Holloway said, was his. Ethan watched Mercer, trying to reconcile the quiet old man with the shape of that story. Felt impossible. Yet Pierce opened the folio and withdrew a faded photograph protected in plastic. 5 men beside a battered radio mast, all mud-stained and unsmiling. Holloway touched one blurred figure. He brought all 5 out. Mercer shook his head faintly. "Luck brought weather." Holloway almost laughed. "You always said that." The general then did something stranger still. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a worn black challenge coin rubbed smooth at the edges. On one side a raven spread its wings. He placed it in Mercer's palm with a reverence Ethan had only seen at memorial services. "I have carried this 38 years waiting to return it." Mercer turned the coin once under the sun, thumb brushing the metal as if reading Braille. For a heartbeat his eyes clouded with memory. Ethan saw then not a legend but a man who had carried too much quietly. The youngest cadet beside Ethan whispered, almost involuntarily, "Sir, why was he here cleaning floors?" Holloway heard him. "Because some men do not spend their lives announcing who they were." He let the answer hang. Then his gaze settled hard on Ethan. "And because institutions are tested by how they treat the unrecognized." Ethan felt each word like measured blows without violence. He stepped forward one pace, swallowed, and faced Mercer. "Sir," he said, voice rough, "I was disrespectful." Mercer looked up. There was no triumph in him, no pleasure at apology. Only a long-seasoned mercy. "Cadet," he said, "confidence becomes arrogance when it stops listening." The sentence struck deeper than any lecture Ethan had endured at the academy. Beyond the parade field, afternoon bugles began sounding retreat. Flags stirred. Lights softened over the buildings. And as the notes carried through the warm air, General Holloway quietly said to Pierce, "Prepare the old briefing room." Pierce blinked. "Sir." Holloway's eyes remained on Mercer. "It is time they hear why Raven 6 was never supposed to be forgotten." The old briefing room had not been used for active instruction in years. Its walls were lined with faded campaign maps, brass plaques darkened by time, and framed photographs of graduating classes whose young faces had long ago grown old or disappeared into history. Dust floated in the angled light of late afternoon as General Warren Holloway led the way inside. Samuel Mercer walking beside him with the quiet reluctance of a man who had spent decades avoiding rooms like this. Ethan Cole and the other cadets followed in silence, their footsteps subdued on the worn wooden floor. Major Nolan Pierce shut the heavy door behind them, and the latch sounded strangely final. At the center of the room stood an old briefing table scarred by generations of elbows and field notebooks. Holloway placed the leather folio there and opened it. No one spoke. Even Ethan seemed afraid sound might break whatever had gathered in the room. Holloway withdrew a yellowed acetate overlay and spread it over an old terrain map. Rivers, contour lines, forgotten border marks. He rested one finger on a valley circled in red grease pencil. "Operation Raven Glass," he said, and even the name seemed to lower the temperature. Ethan had never heard it in any academy curriculum. Pierce had, but only as rumor. Mercer leaned one hand on the table, looking at the map without expression. "They still kept the overlays," he murmured, almost to himself. Holloway nodded. "I kept this one." He looked to the cadets. "You asked for a call sign. This is what one can carry." He spoke then not as a general lecturing subordinates but as a witness giving back a debt. He described a surveillance mission where radios failed in mountain weather and extraction routes vanished under monsoon flood. Not heroics. Decisions. Patience. The discipline to wait when panic begged movement. He described a voice on a compromised channel speaking once every hour, never louder than necessary, guiding scattered teams home through darkness by terrain memory alone. That voice was Raven 6. Ethan listened with his pulse in his throat. The room felt smaller, as if history itself pressed close. Holloway opened the folio again and removed a declassified commendation draft, and signed, its award section struck through with black bars. He was nominated for recognition that could never be issued because the mission officially did not exist. One cadet whispered, "Then nobody knew." Mercer answered before Holloway could. "The right people knew." His voice carried no bitterness, only fact. Pierce moved toward a steel cabinet at the wall and, after a hesitation, unlocked it with an old key hanging beneath a frame. Inside sat a field radio preserved under canvas. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly at the sight. Holloway almost smiled. "We kept it for the museum that never got built." He lifted the handset and offered it to Mercer. For a moment the old veteran did not take it. Then his fingers closed around the worn grip. A faint crackle escaped the speaker, dry as old leaves. The room went still. Mercer raised the handset near his ear as if listening across decades. Ethan would remember that silence all his life. Then Mercer lowered it and said quietly, "Still hisses before it tells the truth." Even Holloway laughed softly. The tension eased. but only enough to make what came next land harder. The general turned to Ethan. "Cadet Cole, what did you think a call sign was this morning?" Ethan answered honestly. "A nickname, sir." Holloway nodded once. "For some men, it is a record of who others trusted when everything else failed." Ethan looked at Mercer, shame now mixed with awe. The old veteran met his gaze and gave the smallest motion toward the map. "Come here." Ethan stepped beside him. Mercer pointed to a narrow ridgeline traced in fading pencil. "You see that bend? Wind shifts there at dusk. We used stars and tree lines before satellites." Ethan stared as if being admitted into a hidden school. Outside the briefing room windows, the lowering sun cast bronze across the parade field. Somewhere a distant rotor thump moved over the horizon. Holloway glanced toward the sound, then back to Mercer. "They are sending the honor detail," he said quietly. Mercer sighed, almost amused. "You made this too large, Warren." The general shook his head. "No, sir." His voice dropped. "Scheduled training." Even Ethan knew that. Major Nolan Pierce checked a message flashing on his secure phone, then looked up at General Warren Holloway with open disbelief. "Sir," he said quietly, "they sent a ceremonial escort." Holloway gave only a small nod, as though expecting no less. Samuel Mercer, however, let out a tired breath and shook his head. "This is getting theatrical." But there was no real protest in it. The old veteran still held the preserved field handset in one hand, thumb unconsciously brushing its worn edge. Holloway stepped toward him. "There are officers on this base who have trained under your methods without ever hearing your name. Today that changes." Mercer looked at the floorboards for a long moment, as if weighing whether some silences were better left unbroken. Then he set the handset gently down. "Names were never the point." "No," Holloway said, "but memory is." Before more could be said, the briefing room door opened and two members of the Academy Honor Detail entered in dress uniform, young lieutenants with polished brass and faces visibly tense. They halted at attention. One spoke, voice steady but almost reverent. "Sir, the Commandant requests Mr. Mercer's presence on the parade ground." Ethan felt a chill despite the warm room. The Commandant did not request. He summoned, yet here even protocol seemed to bend. Mercer rose slowly from the table. Holloway stepped aside, not leading but accompanying him, and the room moved as one toward the door. Mercer slowed. "Warren," he murmured, "what have you done?" Because men who had worn command long enough knew when not to fill a sacred pause. Then he turned slightly toward the gathered officers. "There is one thing these cadets have not heard," he said. "Why Raven 6 was never spoken lightly." His voice carried across the field, and even those on the far edges leaned in. Holloway faced Ethan again. "You heard he brought 5 men home." He paused. "What you did not hear is one of them was me." A visible ripple passed through the formation. Even some senior instructors exchanged startled looks. The general continued, but his tone had changed. Less formal, more personal. He spoke of being 23 and certain rank made him ready for anything. Of losing his bearings in fog-thick hills where radios sputtered and maps lied. Of hearing one steady voice over static giving compass corrections from memory alone. "I was a lieutenant with too much confidence," he said. "He kept me alive long enough to become worth something." Ethan felt those words strike him almost as if meant directly for him. Mercer gave a faint shake of the head. "You became worth something on your own." Holloway looked at him with the dry patience of an old student still correcting a teacher. "Respectfully, sir, I disagree." A few quiet smiles moved through the line, tension easing just enough to deepen what followed. Holloway nodded to Major Nolan Pierce, who stepped forward carrying the old black challenge coin returned earlier. But now Pierce also held a small velvet case. Ethan recognized immediately it was not standard Academy protocol. Holloway opened it. Inside lay a tarnished insignia patch, black thread nearly worn gray, a raven stitched over a 6-point signal burst. Time had softened its edges but not its gravity. Mercer's eyes fixed on it. For the first time all day emotion moved openly across his weathered face. Not pride, something closer to grief meeting gratitude. "I thought that was lost," he said. Holloway answered, "It was kept." Before anyone could absorb that, the general turned to Ethan. Cadet Cole stepped forward. Ethan obeyed. Holloway placed the old patch in his hands. "Hold this." Ethan's fingers trembled, touching cloth older than his father. The general then said for all to hear, "This cadet challenged a legend without knowing it. Today he will witness what legacy feels like." He motioned for Ethan to present the patch back to Mercer. The gesture was simple, almost unbearably human. Ethan lifted the insignia toward the old veteran with both hands, voice rough. "Sir, I was wrong." Mercer accepted the patch slowly. "Good," he said. Ethan blinked, startled. Mercer's pale eyes softened. "Being wrong is how men begin learning." A murmur almost like relieved laughter moved through the formation. Then, without warning, the commandant called the entire cadet brigade to attention. Hundreds of boots struck pavement in one unified crack. The sound rolled over the field like thunder. Ethan instinctively stepped back into line, but this time not from fear, from reverence. Holloway raised one hand. "Render honors." And in a motion few living men on that field had ever witnessed outside funerals, the entire formation saluted one quiet veteran in a faded maintenance jacket. Mercer stood very still under that impossible weight of recognition. The evening sun burned bronze across his face. For several seconds even he seemed unable to speak. Then he looked at Ethan, who had once mocked him, and said almost in a whisper, "Remember this, son. Titles fade. Reputation echoes. Character remains." At that moment the rotor wash from the waiting helicopter lifted dust along the runway, and Holloway leaned close enough only Mercer heard him. "There is one more thing." Mercer glanced sideways. "Warren, what now?" The general's mouth curved faintly. "You are about to see why command sent an honor detail instead of a car." For a long moment Samuel Mercer said nothing. Hundreds of raised salutes held across the parade ground, unmoving beneath the bronze wash of evening, while rotor blades turned slow beyond the cordon and stirred warm dust in soft spirals. Ethan Cole felt his arm begin to tremble from holding the salute, yet he did not lower it. None of them did, because something larger than ceremony had taken hold. General Warren Holloway stepped back half a pace and gave a slight signal toward the helicopter. From beside it emerged four older men in civilian jackets, silver-haired, weathered, walking with the unhurried bearing of those long past proving themselves. They were not introduced. They did not need to be. Mercer saw them and froze more completely than he had at any moment that day. The first man, tall and cane-supported, smiled through eyes already wet. "You still late to your own briefings, Sam?" he called. A startled breath escaped Mercer, something almost like laughter breaking through decades. Ethan looked from face to face, then understood with a shock. The five in the old photograph. Not memory. Here. Holloway had brought them. One by one they approached, and without fanfare, without speeches, each placed a hand on Mercer's shoulder. A reunion built not from sentimentality but from time endured. The parade ground watched in absolute stillness. Even officers who had seen combat stood motionless with softened eyes. Mercer looked from one old comrade to another as if confirming ghosts had substance. "I buried all of you in my mind years ago," he murmured. The cane-supported veteran grinned. "Bad habit of yours. We kept living." Quiet laughter moved through those nearest. Ethan had never seen reverence feel so human. Holloway let the moment breathe before turning to the assembled cadets. "Lower honors." Arms came down in perfect unison. But no one relaxed. The commandant stepped forward carrying a simple wooden shadow box, not ornate, no brass plate polished for display, only old service pieces arranged with dignity. The black raven patch, the returned challenge coin, a faded reconnaissance tab. He offered it to Mercer. "The Academy requests permission to place these in the Hall of Legacy, with your name." Mercer studied the box, then slowly shook his head. A ripple of surprise passed through the ranks. He turned and held the box toward Ethan. "No," Ethan stared, stunned. Mercer placed it in his hands. "Keep it in the cadet archive. Let those who ask hard questions earn the story. Ethan could barely answer. Yes, sir. His voice broke on the word. The sun had fallen lower now, gilding windows and flagstaffs in copper fire. Retreat sounded again from the far side of the base, lonelier now, almost tender. Mercer looked toward the colors descending and stood unconsciously straighter. Then he faced Ethan once more. What happens after today, Cadet Cole? Ethan swallowed and answered, not from training but conviction. I listen before I judge, sir. Mercer nodded. Then today was not wasted. Holloway smiled faintly, the expression of a debt finally easing. The old comrades moved toward the helicopter as twilight gathered, Mercer among them, not at the center but simply one of 5 once forgotten men. Before boarding, he turned back one last time. Ethan, unable to help himself, snapped to attention and saluted. This time Mercer returned it. No one spoke as the helicopter lifted into darkening sky and banked west, its rotor thump fading into distance until only evening insects and retreat echoes remained. Long after it was gone, cadets stood watching empty air as if unwilling to disturb what had happened. Years later, Ethan Cole, then an officer himself, would pause beside the archive case where a worn raven patch rested under glass and tell new cadets about the afternoon. Arrogance stepped back and respect stepped forward. And he always ended the same way, with words he had first heard from an old veteran in a faded jacket. Some names are not remembered because they demanded honor. They are remembered because they quietly lived it.